All right, good morning, Energy Rogue Nation. Happy Saturday. I've missed you all so much. Welcome back to another weather discussion. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We need to catch up on a lot, and I've been meaning to do a video. A lot of the discussions this week have been either typed or they've been voiced over, so I do appreciate your patience on that. I'm trying to kind of dabble in some different mediums of communicating weather to you guys, so if there's one that you favor a little bit more than the other, then I'll do that a little bit more frequently. So as we're sort of testing out the content of what this will look like for WX Rogue, please, feedback will be greatly appreciated. And speaking of that, before we get into today's video, I'd like to remind every single one of you that we do have this survey for you to fill out. It's just a Google form, and it's to get your feedback on the WX Rogue page. Now, as I've been harping on the last couple of weeks, I've been meaning to make this survey or feedback form, if you will. This feedback that you provide us will really help in continuing to improve this product. And I would also like to add a friendly reminder that when I say we're in the final home stretch of the first iteration, we truly are. There's just a couple more products that we're finalizing, and we will have the first iteration. But it certainly won't be the last. So if there are those of you out there, for example, that would like to see more European weather products, put that in the feedback, right? I know there's quite a few of you that probably care about European weather. So if that is indeed the case, please let me know. Fill out that Google form. If there's a particular product that you want to see, for example, when it comes to European weather, if it's something similar to what we have on the website, but you want it geared towards Europe, great opportunity to post that feedback in that form. We're going to be collecting feedback up until October the 12th. So now is your opportunity to fill it out. Should take you only about 5 to 10 minutes, so not really too tedious. It's just a mixture of some short answer and multiple choice. But again, that's going to go a really long way for us to continue to improve this WX Rogue product that I think all of us can agree would be really, really useful for the energy and nat gas space. And it already has been for many of you that have used it, and thank you so much for giving us your initial feedback and positive comments about it. Really do appreciate it. And just as a reminder, WX Rogue does continue to remain free to use at the moment, right? So here's the freemium product. The premium product is also available for free for a limited time. So take advantage of it. Continue to look at it. Continue to check with it. We're not going to talk much about temperature today. However, what I will say about temperature, if I can make a quick comment about it, is that we are definitely expecting a drop in cooling degree days for quite a few regions across the United States. And in particular, especially true for the Middle Atlantic and the Eastern Atlantic. For example, take a look here at our population-weighted heating degree days. Look at the Middle Atlantic spiking up by the 10th and the 11th. The reason why that is, in case you're wondering why we're seeing such a spike in our heating degree days towards the end of this week into early next week, is because of this progressive pattern that we're in right now. So just to start with the temperature conversation real briefly, and then we'll dive into some tropics, I just want to comment on this and go a little bit further. We do have an area of high pressure that is out towards the middle central Pacific, call it. And when you have high pressure, or what we call upper level ridging in the northern and central Pacific, what that tends to do is then bring down colder air, right? So, as a result of that, what you'll find is as we go forward, for example, on the GFS, we get that area of high pressure that was initially in the Central Pacific to move eastward and position itself over the Rockies as well as the Pacific Northwest and even the Midwest as well. So areas like the Rockies, the upper Midwest, the West Coast, you're going to be seeing well above normal temperatures to start out October. Meanwhile, look what happens. You get that high pressure to move inland, and then here comes that cold air that dives south into the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. So, the main storyline heading into what would be next week is it's going to be a tale of two cities, for a lack of a better term, or a tale of two regions. Region 1 is going to be seeing well above normal temperatures. Region 2, which would be the Northeast, New England, Mid-Atlantic, you're actually going to be seeing some below to well below normal temperatures as we get some of that Canadian cold air to advance southward. So that's why you're seeing such a spike in your populated weighted heating degree days, because remember, we're factoring in population. Middle Atlantic, the Northeast, those EIA regions have very dense population centers, so anytime we see a sudden temperature shift like this, it's going to pick up on it, and it's going to then spike your heating degree days. So those are the two temperature storylines as we head into what would be early next week and really into the rest of this weekend. I did say late this week. It's Saturday now, so we should really say early next week to late next week. Expect that trend to persist. Now, when I mention that we're in a progressive pattern, the one thing I want to note is that progressive pattern means we get a lot of these waves in our jet stream, right? These trough ridge, trough ridge, trough ridge. Any of you guys that have done math before or have had the privilege of doing trigonometry, you're familiar with the sine and cosine graphs. Well, this is an example of that in real time. We're essentially seeing a lot of peaks and valleys, troughs and ridges. And so this temperature regime is not going to be a permanent fixture, right? So in a case of a progressive pattern, while the Middle Atlantic is expected to be below normal temperatures heading into next week, and the rest of the country being well above average with temperatures, right, in terms of that, that's not going to stay for long. You actually may see a flip of that, where the Midwest and the West Coast see more of those below normal temperatures, and then the East Coast sees above normal. That's what we call a progressive pattern, a lot of oscillating. So if it's a question about whether or not this is a consistent thing that's going to be happening here in the next couple of weeks, my answer to that is no. And I'm pretty confident in that because right now we're sort of in this flux. We're transitioning seasons away from what was summer. We're trying to get slowly into the fall and eventually into the winter. And when this happens, this seasonal change, there's a tendency to have a lot of oscillation here in our temperatures. So be mindful of that, especially for our trading friends here, that this is something you want to keep in the back of your mind. Of course, there's other factors, as we know, that derives our natural gas pricing and our crude pricing over time. But of course, weather does play a pretty prominent role, especially in the case of nat gas directly. When we talk about tropical systems here a bit, that's when crude can certainly play a role in that too. And this is a very affluential variable to those pricing. So you want to keep that in mind. It's not a consistent pattern we're expecting, just more of this kind of oscillating as we start to transition to winter. So, one other comment I want to make on temperature, though, is that if you've been following our discussions on the live streams with Brian and Bill, the last prediction I made was using the CFS, which is the climate forecast simulation, and that forecasts out temperature and as well as jet pattern trends over the course of a few to several months, right, as opposed to a couple weeks like the GFS does. So, I had made the prediction that, for the most part, October was going to be a little bit more of this zonal pattern. We're not really seeing much of that right now. However, my prediction still remains correct in that we overall are still seeing this above normal temperature regime. I have not changed my prediction as far as winter is concerned, in that I do predict and I do forecast that we will see more of a winter this year than we have last. What does that mean? I'm talking more about wintry precipitation, which helps to drive down temperatures for a lot of the United States. I'm talking about more frequency, an increase in frequency of that colder air that we're even seeing right now being advected southward. Seeing more of a tendency towards cold air and more frequent of it over the course of the season. And it's not, in my prediction, going to be like last year where we have a tale of two seasons, right? It's not going to be like we have warm for the first half and then we have 2 weeks of winter and then we're done. I truly think this year is going to be different. I think we'll have more of a consistent winter, especially for the northern half of the United States. As we get closer to the winter season, and as we eventually start to move away towards the tropics, we will put a stronger lens on that and continue to update you on the forecast for the winter. It is something we're monitoring here in the background, but it's just not something we really talked about as much. So if you have any questions about my winter outlook or anything that it has to relate to the winter forecast, you can post those questions in the WX Rogue Discord server, which is a wonderful place to ask those, and I am more than happy to answer them. It may not be in the form of a video that I'm answering it, but I will certainly type out a response to you. And speaking of that, gosh, I'm just full of segues today. This is awesome. Speaking of questions, Brian, our good friend Brian, of course, one of the founders of Energy Rogue, had asked us here in the Weather Rogue Discord channel. He said, hey, are there any thoughts on the storms in the Yucatan and the Atlantic? That leads as a wonderful transition to the tropics. Now, I just gave you a long-winded answer about my forecast predictions for the winter. And in a way, I was giving myself a pat on the back saying, hey, I'm actually doing a pretty good job so far with the prediction. It's actually, in terms of just these last couple of months heading into what would be winter, so far October's been above normal, and so is September, right? So nothing's really changed there. But there's one thing that I did get wrong, because you guys know meteorologists, we're not perfect. And I will admit when I'm wrong. One of the predictions that I gave a few days ago was talking about the Gulf. And Brian had actually asked me about pretty similar to the questions he's asking today about the tropics. And my original response was, well, Brian and Energy Rogue and everybody that's watching these videos, my response to that is I really don't think the Gulf is going to be as active over these next couple of weeks. Right? I really suspected that there would be a bit of a lull in the action in the short term, and then we would see this activity pick up. Well, that ended up being incorrect, because herein lies Invest 92L, which is currently in the what we'd call the Bay of Campeche, right in the bowl of the Yucatan. And this was a very similar area that we saw, I think it was Debbie was forming and then eventually moved up towards Louisiana. So this has been the second time we've had a system out here towards the Yucatan. Of course, Beryl earlier on in the season moved into this area. But how this system got here, I think, is the most interesting part. And if my memory serves me correctly, this was a system that was actually moving through the really rough terrain of central Mexico, spat out the other side, and is now reforming and forming a new center, forming a new low, or really a center. So it's really the little engine that could, if you guys remember that story, in that this storm has been so resilient to the effects of topography that now the conversation has shifted from, well, this system is just going to be a shell of itself and it's not going to have much impact to Florida, to we could actually have another hurricane impacting Florida in the span of just a week and a half, 2 weeks, which is crazy to think. So we're going to be diving into that in the second half of the conversation. Before we do get started with that, there's one more announcement I'd like to make. If you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, be sure to do so. When you click on that link that you follow to this video, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's completely free. That way you get alerts on when these videos do come out. And of course, for my Energy Rogue members, just a reminder from about 5 minutes ago, post those questions in the Discord and we can always chat there. All right, but here we go. So this is 92L. We gave, I think, enough background story here to where we're at today. And so far, pretty deep convection in the center of the low. This is very healthy. I mean, there is no indication to me that we are seeing a weakening of this system. I believe the name of this system, once it does eventually become a tropical storm, is going to be Genesis. I think that's the name. Don't quote me on that. I think that actually might be the Invest. I'll post the name in the chat once the video is done. But this system is pretty much quasi-stationary, not moving much here. It's pretty much just off the coast here of Mexico, right within that Bay of Campeche. And as I've said, it's very healthy. Now, I wanted to check to see if there was any reconnaissance. We currently do not, but expect there to be reconnaissance missions that go out to this system at some point. We don't have any yet. There's none that have so far done it. But as this eventually moves off towards the east, I suspect that we will see exactly that. And remember, these reconnaissance missions help us to collect in situ data that is then fed back into the models. It gives us a little bit more of a correction. Why that's important in the context of these models is because we are only going off of limited data in order to create this forecast. Let me give you an example here. Here is the latest, and actually let me back out of this. I'm going to show you the intensity guidance first, and then I'm going to show you the track. This should give you an idea of how uncertain we are in terms of severity. Right now, again, I haven't shown you the path yet. We'll get to that here in a moment. But the important thing to take away from this is notice the spread by all of these models for the forecast intensity. It is all over the board. I mean, we're talking anywhere between, at this point, a tropical storm and a major hurricane. That is way too much spread. So what I'm not going to do today is give you a definitive answer as far as what we're going to see out of this, because to be quite honest with you, I'm not even sure myself. What I will say, though, is I think I have enough confidence to say that we will likely see, certainly on the threshold of a tropical storm, if not at least a Category 1 hurricane, by the time it gets closer to Florida in the next few to several days. By the way, this forecast hour, it's by hours, not days, and our wind speed here is in the y-axis. This forecast it essentially would take us out to right around that Tuesday, Wednesday time frame, so around the early to middle of next week for Florida. And like I said, intensity is not quite known yet, but my suspicion is that once we start to get some reconnaissance data and we start to cut through this thing, which again, I suspect that to be as soon as today, if not, maybe tonight into tomorrow, we're going to see some correction here on our intensity and hopefully get a better scope as far as the severity. Now, if we were to assess the tracks here, I did plot a couple things on Python. This is using a package called Tropics, which is a wonderful package to use. This is the GEFS forecast tracks for 92L. And this takes us into hour 96. So again, we're really talking about by the time we get to, say, the middle of next week. Notice how, as far as the track is concerned, you see all these different lines here that are plotted. And these are all different members of the GEFS ensemble, right? And so this blue ellipse is what we use to give more of a consensus on where the models are clustered. So for example, if we have an ellipse that is really large, like this, well then our uncertainty of the track is very high, right? Because the ellipses is essentially denoting that all these members are all over the board. But, that being said, this ellipse is rather elongated, which tells us that there's actually pretty good confidence in the pathing of this. Now, you're probably thinking, well, Brendan, didn't you just say that we're waiting on reconnaissance to give us better data? Yes, but not for necessarily the track of it. Because, surprisingly enough, it's not the track that we're uncertain about, it's the intensity of it, right? So, the track itself is actually pretty confident right now that we'll likely see this system, by the time we get to the middle of next week, positioned to impact somewhere within Florida. Typically, I don't give this kind of certainty this far out, but the reason why I do is because of the fact that we have a cold front that's going to be moving through this area, right? So if I draw this here, let's say we use blue, by the time we get to the middle of next week, there's going to be a big backdoor cold front that's pretty much elongated from an upper level low that's off the page up towards the northeast. This cold front, of course, provides a lot of shear. And if the storm, for example, was to be up towards the Gulf by the time this cold front was here, it would just shear it apart. But what this cold front's actually going to act to do is suppress the track of this system and keep it in this area as opposed to moving more north. So don't think of the cold front as a weakening variable to this system in terms of its shear. Think of it more as a steering mechanism. And so that's why, at least from the GEFS, the ensemble point of view for this model, that's why we see that this ellipses that we plotted is so elongated and not so wide. Because if it was wider, okay, then we have to have a conversation about we really don't know where this is going to hit. But I have very high confidence that regardless of the magnitude, the main area of impact is going to be somewhere within this area. Now, the other thing I'll mention too is, and I guess the biggest concern that I have is when we also take into account these other models aside from the GEFS, here's also a product we use with Tropical. This plots not just the GEFS, but it's also plotting the hurricane models. Look how confident this is. I mean, minus the UK model and minus the Canadian, our hurricane models are pretty much in strong agreement right now. There is not much budging here. And like I said, the reason for that is because a lot of our steering current is going to, let me just erase this here. A lot of our steering current is going to steer this system off towards the east. And what's preventing it from going more northeast is that you have this cold front, and again, we'll call it, for a lack of a better term, a backdoor cold front, that eventually is draped across the Gulf. And that will suppress it from going any more north, because that storm's going to have a tendency to then keep shifting east, parallel to that cold front, right? So, or I should say, well, technically parallel, yeah, perpendicular to it. So that is going to be the catalyst here. That's why we're not having a conversation about the Panhandle again. As a matter of fact, the Panhandle should be fine from a direct landfall. There still will be some impacts, but direct landfall would take us more at the moment into this area. This as a forecaster concerns the hell out of me, because one of the worst case scenarios that we really haven't seen yet in a long time, and Ian was close to this, was a direct impact to Tampa St. Pete. Tampa St. Pete has a lot of shoreline property along the bay. The bay will actually act as an enhancer for direct storm surge, because you have storm surge that moves into the bay. That bay will suppress that, and it actually increases the height. And that's not even factoring in high tide. So Tampa St. Pete, just from a forecasting perspective, aside from a direct landfall to Houston, this is arguably one of the worst case scenarios you want in tropical forecasting. And we haven't truly seen this in quite some time. Now, this position can still change. I mean, there is still a possibility that maybe this system moves slightly more north and doesn't have such a direct impact. But as it looks right now, I'm beginning to grow very concerned about a direct landfall to Tampa. That would be catastrophic. It would be. And we've already seen catastrophe in Asheville, and that was more inland. But we're talking about a coastal city. And Tampa is a highly vulnerable one that, again, the last time we saw something even remotely close was Ian. And Ian didn't even have a direct landfall to Tampa St. Pete. It actually ended up going, I believe, either more south or more north than that. So we'll continue to monitor that, but that's something everybody should be keeping in mind and keeping a very close eye on, because if that eye wall gets even remotely close and that wind is moving essentially into the bay, that is a true worst case scenario, as opposed to wind or storm surge that's moving moving towards the northeast, right? You're talking about direct storm surge that would move into the bay, and that's pretty alarming. So hoping that's not the case. Hopefully we get some sort of wobble here, and this storm will wobble as it progresses east, so we may even get a little bit more of a wobble to the north that could maybe spare Tampa. But of course, the other question mark is, how intense is this storm going to be? That's ultimately what this whole conversation comes down to. How intense are we talking? And right now, that's really the catalyst here. We don't quite know yet, but of course we will keep all of you updated. Here's a couple more products that I want to show as I continue to tab through. Here is the latest observations with our sea surface temperatures, and as you can see with 92L, once again, sea surface temperatures between 29 degrees and 31 degrees Celsius. That is absolutely perfect. That's as good as you want it. We have very little shear. As a matter of fact, our shear tendency, if we were to look at our mid-level shear, our shear tendency is actually up towards the Gulf right now. Very little shear influence in this corridor. So this storm has plenty of room to run with very little inhibition. And if we were to actually dissect this a little bit further in terms of what we're seeing on just convergence and divergence here, let's take off the mid-shear, we'll look at divergence. A lot of upper-level divergence. We're seeing that here in our deep convection we showed earlier. We're seeing about 30 to 40 as our magnitude in terms of divergence. That's very good. That's a very healthy developing system here, and may even be a tropical storm as soon as tonight, if not tomorrow. So very intense development taking place as we speak right now. Very little inhibition from this storm. And remember, we have westerly winds in the upper levels that are coming off of central Mexico, and that's really helping to enhance this storm. Remember, tropical development can come from these land breezes too, and that can really help to kick up convection. It's exactly what we're seeing right now. I will show you one last product before we call it a day, and that's going to be from our friends over at Tropical Tidbits. And I just want to show you the latest forecast model for where this is being taken. I know we showed you the tracks, but I also want to show you the pathing using the GFS, for example. So here, very closely, is 92L. It's somewhat off the page, but it's still within our scope. And if we play this forward and take this over the next 24 hours, it shows a tropical storm developing here as soon as, actually, if not tonight, definitely tomorrow, like we talked about. And then look at that development, 9:55, 9:48, 9:46, and then making landfall pretty much at Tampa St. Pete with the eye wall as soon as what would be Wednesday morning as a 9:50. Now, once again, I cannot stress this enough. Intensity is certainly a major question mark right now, and we really won't know until probably a little bit more of a clear lens until we get reconnaissance. But it's important to note that a lot of our models are showing pretty good consensus on its development. I mean, for example, here's the half-say, one of our hurricane models. This has it, the eye wall, pretty close to Tampa again. This is a 9:57 we see at around Wednesday morning, early Wednesday afternoon. We also have the halves B as a 92L, and this is making landfall, for example, as a 971, which would be below the threshold of a major, or just about below a threshold of a major. And then if we were to look at the halves B parent, which I believe is a control model, this has it as a 971 to a 975. So a lot of question marks here. I mean, we got a lot of variation with some of our output, and we're going to see a lot of fluctuation with what that looks like. But for the first part of your question, Brian, ultimately we are expecting some form of a tropical storm and or a hurricane to make landfall somewhere within close to Tampa St. Pete by the time we get to Wednesday morning. And there's very high confidence in that. And as a matter of fact, the National Hurricane Center, I'm not going to show the page, but has a 90% chance of tropical development with 92L in the next 7 days. And I believe it's now up to either a 70 or an 80% chance in like the next 3 days. So very high confidence nonetheless with what will be our next hurricane or tropical system, named storm I should say, for once again the Gulf and particularly Florida. So we'll keep you posted on the intensity of it. To the second part of your question with the Atlantic, Brian, because we're in that progressive pattern, my prediction has not changed. I am not expecting any of those storms to get close to the Atlantic coastline, because remember, when you have this progressive pattern here, ridge and trough, that end of the ridge is going to steer those storms away from the coast. So we haven't seen an Atlantic basin landfall. We've seen storms come up from the Atlantic. We saw a barrel, but it went through the Gulf and shot the gap in the Gulf. But we're seeing a lot of fish storms in the Atlantic, but we're not seeing a lot of direct coastal impacts like a storm going directly into the Carolinas or directly into Virginia or Georgia. A lot of it has just been pretty much the Caribbean and the Gulf that have made those impacts because of the pattern that exists. So impacts, of course, with this system are likely with the one in the Gulf, but as far as the other tropical developments such as Kirk and the other system we have that's now a hurricane out in the Atlantic Basin, not expecting any direct impacts to the United States at this time. Listen, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you did enjoy the video, and if you have any questions in the meantime, be sure to post those, in the Discord comments down below. You can tell as I'm starting to lose my voice, I think I've talked plenty. I think that's my body telling me it's time to shut up. So anyway, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I will have a video posted tomorrow that gives an update on some of the questions that exist today in relation to 92L, and we are continuing to churn away at the WX Rogue product, and we are going to be getting closer and closer to winter. Christmas is around the corner, pretty much, so and as well as the holiday season for those that celebrate other holidays. So that also means the winter discussions will start to pick up. So definitely be on the lookout for WX Rogue additional products, and be sure to fill out that feedback form posted on Discord. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll be back here tomorrow morning. Take care.